So I'm here to talk to you about my most recent book, which is called The First Political Order: How Sex Shapes Governance and National Security Worldwide. But first of all, especially for any students who happen to be in the audience, I wanted to make sure that you knew that the Bush School of Government and Public Service has a program on women, peace, and security. And that this concentration, which is at the master's level, has an in-depth curriculum looking at a whole variety of things, such as women in development, women in armed conflict, women and environmental conflict, and so forth. And so if you have any undergraduates who are very keen on moving forward, send them to me. I would be delighted to talk with them about the possibilities at the Bush School for them at the master's level. All right, wonderful. Well, that's the cover of the book. So if you need a good reading book for your table, you know, your nightstand, this is the book. It's like 700 pages long, so you could easily fall asleep every night for like a full year if you read a few pages before you went to sleep. It's, in a sense, it's kind of my magnum opus because it was kind of a major brain dump of 30 years worth of studying this material. And so I think you might find it of great interest. So I exhort you to take a look at it. All right, so we are definitely not the first to put forward the idea that the very first political order in any society is actually the sexual political order established by men and women in the society. And the character of that first order molds the society, its governance, and its behavior. Again, these are assertions that are not new to be made. In fact, sometimes I joke with my students. I say, okay, let's pretend we're in a video game design class. And the only parameter I give you is that there's two roughly equal size types of players. And if they don't figure out a way to cooperate, the game's over for everybody. Make me a game. And they're like, well, you haven't told us enough. Tell us about these two groups. You know, is one kind of superior to the other? Or are they equal? You know, if there are decisions to be made, are they made by both? Or are they made by one? What about if there's a conflict of interest? You know, how do they figure out whose interests predominate? And lastly, of course, the queen of all political questions, how are valuable resources distributed among these two groups? So whether it be land or wealth or whatever counts for value in the society, how are those distributed between the two groups? And I say, congratulations, you have just proven, right, that the sexual order is a political order. It is a deeply political order, right? And how that order develops, what it looks like, right, is going to then affect everything else about the society. And we could do a thought experiment, right, based on those four questions. We could identify societies at sort of one end of the scale where the two groups are much more equally involved in decision making, equally possessors of valuable resources, and so on. But we could also imagine the other end of the spectrum where everything was unequal in favor of one of the groups. And we could imagine a plethora, right, of other possibilities all in between, couldn't we? Yeah. And we, of course, we're going to argue that that's, in fact, exactly what we see today. Oh, see, I got that upside down. Now I got it right side out. Now, as you can imagine, I'm interested in relations between men and women. And so what I'd like to do is to figure out what would count as evidence of where along that spectrum a political society falls, any sort of society that we have, human society falls. And for many years, too many to count, I was always looking at what we call the big three in women, peace, and security studies. I was looking at female literacy and as well as school graduation rates. So in other words, I was looking at the education of women. I'd be looking at female labor force participation as a proxy for how much how economically empowered women were. And of course, I'd be looking at something like female parliamentary representation, looking at the degree to which women had a voice in politics. And so I was, on my merry way, running regressions with these as independent or dependent variables. And it's closer to 20 years now. Gosh, time has flown. But my previous university was hosting a group of from Afghanistan. And this was actually some of the first female members of the Loya Jirga in Afghanistan, because I think you may remember that the United States imposed a quota of 25% female representation in its Congress, even though the United States at the time did not have 25% representation of women in its legislature. We could go on and on about hypocrisy, but we won't. So women were elected, and I think there were 5 of them that had come out sort of on this tour of the United States and were stopped off at our university, and we were invited to hear them speak, and then we were invited to host them for a lunch. And you know how these academic things are. They were like, okay, Valerie, you tag her, make her feel welcome. I, being the usual introverted academic type, was like, what do I say to her? We nerds never know how to make chit chat over lunch, do we? So I thought to myself, okay, be positive here. So I was like, this is such a great time for women in Afghanistan, isn't it? Here you are, you're a pediatrician, university trained, and now you're a member of the Loya Jirga. Wow, women are really becoming empowered in Afghanistan. And she got this look on her face. I knew I'd blown it. And she said, Valerie, you don't understand, do you? She said, I could go home today to my home, and my husband could divorce me by saying, I divorce you 3 times. That's all it would take. We wouldn't have to go to a judge. We wouldn't have to go through court. He would have divorced me. And if he divorced me, he would get custody of the kids, because custody of the kids always goes with a man in Afghanistan. And she said, furthermore, if my husband divorced me, I would have nowhere to live, because my father's family would not take me home for the shame of it. And you cannot live as a woman on your own, even in the capital city, right, without there being dishonor and shame involved. And then she said, even if my husband doesn't divorce me, right, I'll have very little say over whom my children marry or when they marry, right? So she's like, how empowered am I really, Valerie? And I was like, all right, I am looking at the wrong things, right? You want to know where some of the highest female educational attainment is to be found? Saudi Arabia. Highest female labor force participation? You could look at something like the Philippines, right? Highest female parliamentary representation? Rwanda. Okay, so clearly I was looking in the wrong place to see that first political order, wasn't I? And so I decided, based on that crucial conversation, that I was going to look elsewhere. Okay, I was going to look at things like how much say does a woman have about getting married? How old is she when she gets married? Up until very recently in Saudi Arabia, did you know a bride did not have to attend her own wedding? As long as her guardian and the groom showed up and agreed, she was married. How much say does a woman have within her marriage, right? Can she actually determine what money is spent on what, or at what age her children will marry, and so forth? What types of property and inheritance rights does a woman have? Are there inequities in family law, such as we just mentioned with regard to divorce and child custody? Are marriages patrilocal, where the bride moves to the husband's family's compound? Do we see bride price or dowry? Right? Bride price refers to the price a groom's family pays to the bride's father to conduct the marriage. Dowry is the term for when a bride's family has to pay the groom and his family to take the burdensome bride off their hands. Do we see polygyny, right? Marriage of more than one woman to one man. Do we see cousin marriage? 2/3 of all marriages in Pakistan, for example, are cousin marriages. Does the state view domestic violence, or the society view domestic violence and femicide as normal, even expected, even at times obligatory? And lastly, is rape treated as a property crime against the guardian of the woman, whether that be her husband or her father? This is really where we need to look to figure out where along that spectrum that political order is. So my colleagues and I came up with this representation of what we looked at and considered to be some of the direct and systematic, right, customized, customary means of subordinating women. Almost, if you will, the game, right, that's played between the two sexes within the society, right? What sort of things exist? So you start in the top left-hand corner. Obviously, the direct, the final, the ultimate sanction is male violence against women. How countenanced is male violence against women within the society? And as Sandra noted, we have an immense online database called the Women's Stats Database, and it's free to use. There's no price to be paid for seeing this data. And what we have found is that male violence against women is still a significant problem, even in countries that you would probably think were relative paradises for women. So one of the things that confounds even my students is that even in places such as Iceland and Sweden, right, no fewer than 1 in 4 women has experienced domestic violence. That's the best we've been able to do thus far as the human species. Now, the worst we've been able to do thus far, looking at surveys done by DHS, the worst we have is countries where about 87% of women have experienced domestic violence. Okay, so that's our range, right? 25% to 87% is what we know. But using violence against women all the time is not very efficient, is it? It's not very efficient. And so we also have systematic means of subordinating women as well. Moving along the little circle here, we call this kind of the syndrome of subordinating women, is you'll find that in many societies, it is men who control access to valuable resources. And this is usually done by exogamy, which means marriage out. Women marry out. They are not actually, in many societies, in the family line at all. They may not be listed on the genealogies because they're marrying into other families. And so the true family is the grandfather, son, grandson, and so forth. And that's where all of the valuable resources are held. They're held within that patrilineal line. And so that means that women usually do not inherit very much. In fact, it's usually their bride price that is considered their inheritance, and may hold very little in the way of property rights themselves. I was actually reading earlier today about the Ladies' Library Association here in Kalamazoo, and discovered that when a wealthy widow was trying to deed some land to the association, at that time, that was 1869, if I'm not messing that up. So that's like 150 years ago. She didn't have the right, even though she was the sole inheritor. There were no children, nobody else, so they had to give it to her. She actually could not, under the law in Kalamazoo, Michigan, give that plot of land to the Ladies' Library Association. They actually had to pass a special bill allowing her to do that before the land for the library could even be gifted. So if you think that this is something that hasn't been in Western society, you'd be ignorant, all right? This is shot through every single society, right? Men own property. Men own what's of value. Men pass that value to men. I mean, if we didn't have this, we wouldn't probably have all those wonderful Jane Austen novels, right? Because that's the central plot device for many of them, isn't it? That women lack inheritance and property rights. And so what you see is the development of a more formal patrilineality, right? With patrilocal marriage, where brides marry in. Perhaps there's a cousin marriage variant, so as to not alienate any sort of wealth outside of the family and paying bride price. And what develops out of that, right, is a deep son preference, okay? A deep son preference in the devaluation, a lack of investment in the lives of women in the family, leading to a low age of marriage for girls, because girls are not really part of the family. And if you keep them very long, then they're in danger of being dishonored, which is a burden for the birth family. And so girls are married out very young. And we begin to see a deep inequity in family law and custom, personal status law and custom, where, for example, right, women do not have, or have very small circumstances under which they can divorce a husband. But a husband can divorce a wife for anything at all, okay? Putting too much salt on his food. That's actually a question in a DHS survey, and you'd be surprised how many people answer, yes, the man has the right to divorce a wife if she puts too much salt on his food. Coming up around the other side there, we then see kind of two different kinds of society based upon whether women's labor is actually of value or not. So in societies where women's labor is of value, think sub-Saharan Africa, where women are largely the farmhands, right, for their family. You see the development of a bride price society, right, where the groom's family has to pay the bride's father for the girl. And then you see polygyny, the rise of polygyny, right, where rich men can marry multiple wives and then have a larger number of farmhands that can farm a greater number of acres and thereby enrich himself even more. If the woman's labor is not considered valuable or it's considered dishonorable for a woman to work, then you see, which I'm sure you can anticipate, dowry societies, where it's in fact the bride's family that has to pay the groom to take the burdensome bride off their hands. And in that case, no one wants daughters, right? Because you're going to pay a ton of money to marry those girls off. So we see sex ratio alteration, right, in those societies where daughters are preferentially culled from the birth population. And so these sorts of systematic mechanisms we consider almost as magnetic beads, right? When you start getting one, you're likely to get more until you have the full circle of beads that acts almost as a straitjacket on women within the society. But I'm here to suggest to you that it's not just a straitjacket for women, it's actually monstrous. It's monstrous. The subordination of women ends up hurting not just women, but their children, the men, the entire society. All right? So what is seen as rational, subordinating female interests to male interests, ends up becoming very irrational when you start looking at the larger consequences of that subordination. So what does subordination of women have to do with national security? And this is something that we put forward in our book, which I think is a unique contribution. And what we say is that when a human collective decides that physical security, right, from outgroups, threatening outgroups, is best provided by male-bonded coalitions, right, which is not an irrational thing to think, right, then the interests of those male coalitions will be strictly privileged above the interest of women, okay? Furthermore, male coalitions are strengthened by the subordination in ways that I think you will quickly understand, right? It means that female labor, including reproductive labor, is provided to each male member of that coalition, and that females cannot divert resources away from males. For example, in Kenya, there is a saying that says, "The poorest man is he who does not have a wife to cook for him and make his children," right? In this case, the subordination of women to men allows every member of the male coalition to not be poor, right? They will have female productive and reproductive labor. Secondly, when a male coalition member is low status, right, if subordination of women is sort of the rule for this society, it still means that they are higher in status than any woman in the society. Something that just crossed my inbox before I came over here was a new study done by psychologists showing that in the online gaming community, now I've never been in the online gaming community, so I'm taking this on the merits of the authors here, is that the worst misogyny that is experienced by female gamers comes from which subset of men? The least skilled, least successful gamers. Oh, they're nodding, right? Okay, because these women have blurred the lines, haven't they, between the superior male caste and the inferior female male caste. It's actually the most skilled gamers who are the most civil to women, okay? So when you strictly subordinate females to males, even the lowest status male knows he's superior to every other woman involved. And of course that means that they are also allowed by law to completely dominate their households. I can't tell you how many countries in the world, and I've looked at 176 of them, right, where what a man does to the women in his house is whatever he wants to do, with very little pushback from the state, okay? And then lastly, something that political scientists have even noted who study clan and tribal politics is that male coalitional bonds can be created and cemented by marriage bonds. One of the smartest things that Osama bin Laden did when he was building Al-Qaeda is he forced his top lieutenants to marry each other's sisters and daughters. Because once they were married, they were at least fictive kin. And as a result, they couldn't kill each other in order to achieve their ambitions within the organization. Isn't that interesting? So do men prosper from the subordination of women? Is the male coalition stronger with the subordination of women? Oh, absolutely, right? Absolutely. As Kate Mann, the philosopher, has pointed out, I've always thought her surname was ironic, in her book on misogyny, right? There are real, tangible, immediate, and long-term benefits to men of subordinating women, which is why human history is chock full of it. Right? You cannot find a single civilization in which these mechanisms have not made their appearance in order to subordinate female interests. All right, but I'm here to tell you, as I tried to indicate by the Ouroboros diagram, that this syndrome is really a trap, right? As we've seen, its purpose is to subjugate the interests of women to the interests of extended male kin networks, such as clans or tribes, that are going to provide physical security for the collective from outgroups, right? You can recognize how powerful these male kin networks are in society by looking to see how many of those little magnetic beads in fact exist, right, within the society. However, we're here to tell you that that type of security provision is a trap for the entire society. Governance by extended male kin networks leads to unfortunate outcomes for the group: instability, violence, terror, corruption, autocracy, because it is based on a first political order, a sexual political order of domestic instability, domestic violence, domestic terror, domestic corruption, and domestic autocracy, normalizing it for the entire population. Okay? Furthermore, such society will also experience consequences of those characteristics, right? Anything that's coded female is going to be deemed as less important, right, and of less concern. So whether we talk about health, right, healthcare for the family is always coded female, right? The state will pay little attention to that, right, if we have this subordination of women as the law of society. Food insecurity. Women are often tasked with providing the actual food for the family. Similarly, we also see low economic performance, rentierism, because the first rents are actually extracted from women, right? The first rents are extracted from women. So the extraction of rents is a way to gain power, right, becomes a template for society. Demographic woes, such as very high fertility rates and lack of attention to environmental security, because in virtually all cultures, the earth is coded female, right? And so the subordination and the extraction of resources from Mother Earth is also normalized. In other words, if you take nothing away from what I say tonight, whatever you do to your women, you're going to do to your nation state. All right? Now, nobody in the male coalition believes that, right? Nobody in the male coalition believes that when they subordinate women, they're actually condemning their society to greater instability, terror, corruption, and autocracy than they otherwise would, do they? And yet, I would venture to say that this is, in fact, an iron law of social sciences. What you do to your women, you wind up doing to your nation state. And if you curse your women, you will wind up cursing your nation state. So where do we find more of the symptom subordination mechanisms and practices in place? So if we took that syndrome diagram, right, all those little magnetic beads, and we actually went out and we tried to examine how prevalent those mechanisms were within 176 societies, and the Department of Defense gave you $1.5 million to do it because otherwise you couldn't, what would you find? Now, I don't think there are any surprises here, right? But in terms of counting beads, right, now we're not looking, I mean, I can make a very good argument for you that violence against women in the United States is so far worse than many of its NATO allies that it's not even funny. But if we were actually just counting the number of beads that you had, right, this would be the kind of picture that you would find, right? So we have that full spectrum, don't we? We have those on one side, well, almost one side of the spectrum, where women are treated more as an equal class. We never see elimination of male violence against women. I'll just put it that way. But we have nations at the very other side that have virtually all of that straitjacket for women. And we have everything in between. And we have nations that are going this way. And we have nations that are going this way on that particular spectrum. It really is quite fascinating. Now, let me give you some examples here. Sometimes the link between what's going on with women and what's going on in terms of the security of the nation, sometimes those links are immediate and proximate. Remember we talked about bride price, right? That's the price that a groom's family pays the bride's father for the bride. Well, bride price societies are prone to massive inflation of bride price, okay? So bride price acts as a regressive, universal, almost flat tax on the young men of the society. So while the elites may charge whatever they want, usually within the non-elite society, there is a going rate for a bride. And every father is looking at every other father to see if he's going to raise his price for his daughter. And if they do, they'll raise it a little bit more. And the other guy, you know what I mean? It's just good. It just is very, very prone to sudden inflation. Governments actually see this. You'd be surprised how many governments actually have laws that attempt to cap bride price for the very fact that they know that it just zooms up into the stratosphere. Now, surging bride prices also link you in with polygyny, because as bride prices surge, the only men who can afford wives are the rich men, the elite men, right? They can have more wives, but then that leaves fewer available women for non-elite men. And what you get as young men are priced out of the market and as potential brides are scooped up by rich men is you get a deep sense of grievance among young men, especially at the lower socioeconomic level, the men that cannot afford the bride price and cannot ever imagine that they will marry. So it either significantly delays marriage. For example, I wonder if you could tell me what the average age of marriage for a man in Egypt is. Mid-30s. You may be surprised at that, because the religion of Islam places such a great value on men getting married. But they have to delay it till their mid-30s because the bride prices are so astronomically high. It takes them a decade or more to accumulate enough wealth to marry. So it delays and may even preclude marriage for men. And this is still in societies where, right, we still have those male-bonded extended kin networks. So the man has to marry because he has to produce a son, that next generation of men to carry on the family. Right? So there's severe social consequences for young men who are unable to marry. Now, moment, but there are some groups in society that are willing to provide you with money. Rebel groups, guerrilla groups, terrorist groups are very willing to promise you money. Okay? For example, I'm sure you noted that ISIS-K promised these Tajik men 1 million rubles apiece to participate in the slaughter at that Crocus hall in Russia. Okay? So if you offer young men a sizable chunk of money that will allow them to marry, there are many young men in this type of society that will take you up on that. All right? Who will take you up on that. Of course, the ultimate example is Boko Haram, right? Again, a lot of this never made it to the Western press at all, so you have to actually dig into the Nigerian sources to find it. But there was a huge jump in bride price in northern Nigeria in the early 2000s, and that's when Boko Haram arose. And it uses this as a recruiting strategy. You'll notice that girls are abducted, right? What didn't make the Western press was that always token money is left behind after they kidnap the girls. This is the bride price, okay? So that if these girls are turned into wives, okay, that the custom of bride price has been respected and it is a legitimate marriage, okay? One young lady who had been abducted tried to explain why there were all these abductions of girls, and she said, in this crisis, these men can take a wife at no extra charge. Usually it's very expensive to take a wife, very hard to get married, but not now, right? So by subordinating women through bride price, you destabilize your society because bride prices always inflate. And as you destabilize your society, you give rebel groups, terror groups, and guerrilla groups greater opportunity to recruit these young men to destabilize your country further. So case studies by other authors have been done in South Sudan, in Pakistan, and in Timor-Leste, right, where all of this has fed into civil conflict within those societies. Oh, I want to mention another example. I've been giving lots of stories today. When I first published with my co-author Hilary Matfess an article about the linkage between bride price and instability and civil conflict, I received a great email. We published that article when the United States was still in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is a bride price country. And it was a State Department return address. So I was very curious. So I opened it, And it turned out it was a State Department official who was, in the green zone in Kabul. And he wrote to me and he said, "I feel dumb. I now feel really dumb after reading your article." And he said, not 2 months ago, we had a delegation, and he mentioned a region that was just southeast of Kabul. And they came to our offices. This was city, village elders, town elders. And they, wanted to talk about wedding prices. They were complaining that wedding prices were getting too high, and we Americans needed to do something about that. And I said, wedding prices are ridiculous in America too. These kids, they want limos, they want doves, they want, it's just nuts. I commiserate with you. And, after some tea and so forth, we sent them home. And he said, I now realize they had come to warn us. They had come to warn us that bride prices were getting so high that their young men were going to join the Taliban for the next fighting season to make enough money to marry. And he said, I had no idea. I couldn't see it. I didn't see it till I read your article. And to me, this is a great example of what putting, gender lenses on does. All of a sudden you can see, right, something that's a threat that you never even imagined was a threat before, because the world of what happens with women and marriages and inheritance and so forth has, in your mind, nothing to do with conflict and instability and violence. But it does. Right? It really does. You just can't see it because you don't have the right lenses to see it. Really fascinating stuff. Anyway, sometimes the links are longer term and structural. So some things many of you may have noticed is that that our sex ratios are getting more abnormal over time. That is, that in a normal, non-manipulated population, your overall sex ratio will be 98 men per 100 women, because women live longer than men everywhere. And if they don't, then you've really got a problem subordinating your women. In 1990, when I first started looking at sex ratios, only 5 nations had abnormal sex ratios. And they were all the usual suspects that you can imagine: China, Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan. The male-female global ratio is now over 101.8, which is highly abnormal. We're talking about tens of millions, even over 100 million women that are missing. And now, right, the last censuses were done in 2020, and there were 18 countries that had abnormal birth-sex ratios. And they were from all over the world, and they also represent a wide variety of religions. So Afghanistan, Albania, Armenia, Azerbaijan, China, Georgia, Hong Kong, India, Kosovo, Montenegro, Nepal, North Macedonia, Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, Samoa, Serbia, Taiwan, and Vietnam, all right? All had abnormal birth-sex ratios. And it's also true that the great migration flows that we've been seeing over the last decade are also sex disproportionate as well. I don't know if you've looked at pictures of the southern border, or in 2015 you looked at the pictures of the migrants that were coming into Europe. 85% of them are young adult males. Right? That's very, very common for the first wave of migration to be young adult males. Okay? And that means that because of that disproportion, you begin to see it in destination countries. So, for example, in 2015, when the first real wave hit Europe, some nations closed their border altogether, like Hungary said, nobody's coming. Some nations like Germany said, we're letting in 1 million, that's it, 1 million. But there was one country that said, if you can make it here, you're welcome to stay. And that was Sweden. Many, many people went to Sweden. Furthermore, Sweden said, if you're under 18, we will never deport you for any reason. So you had tons of men going to Sweden who were also claiming to be 16 or 17 years old, even though morphologically they looked a heck of a lot older. So in 2016, Sweden counted noses. And what it found was that among its 16 and 17-year-olds, it had a worse sex ratio than China, right? Sweden had 123 16 and 17-year-old males for every 100 females in its society. And that's actually when Sweden said, whoa, 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 because Swedish women began to feel the heat on this, right? Their mobility was curtailed, there were episodes of violence and so forth, and sexual assault. And so very shortly after, partly because it didn't want to destabilize its populations through sex ratio alteration, even Swedish feminists agreed that the door had to be closed. Isn't that interesting? Very, very interesting stuff. So what happens when you have, a young adult population that is heavily skewed male, disproportionately skewed male? Well, there's actually a large body of research that looks at this, okay? Because you can imagine there have been time periods in which males have been a disproportionate part of the population. Even in American history, think of the Western frontier, okay? The sex ratios there were incredibly lopsided. So from historical cases up to the very present time, we have a fascinating corpus of literature. What do we see? Increased crime rates, increased political protest rates. You see marriage market obstruction, again, where young adult men who are of lower socioeconomic classes simply do not have the possibility to marry and develop deep grievances, leading to easier rebel recruitment. You see a spike in crimes against women, including trafficking and forced prostitution. Mobility restriction for women results, as it did in Sweden. HIV and STD spread is turbocharged as a result. And perhaps you even see an altered calculus of deterrence, right? One of the key aspects of deterring an opponent is to threaten action that will seriously hurt the other nation. Now, many of us think of deterrence simply in terms of nuclear exchange, but it applies to all conflicts as well. And what is being threatened in non-nuclear conflicts? Loss of life. Loss of life that is unbearable to the society, right, that would dare to break the peace. Well, what happens if you, as China does, have 50 million young adult men who are surplus to the number of women in society? How does a war of attrition look like then? Well, maybe it no longer looks like the worst thing that could happen to your nation. Maybe, in fact, it looks like one way out of a problem for your nation. So the calculus of deterrence between nations may be profoundly altered by alterations in the sex ratio. All right, so is there any real evidence that high syndrome scores, right, syndrome being that group of magnetic beads we talked about, are associated with worse outcomes for nation states holding other important variables constant? And that's what DoD paid us to do, right? They paid us to make the case that subordinating of women did in fact lead to worse outcomes for nation states. So we had a grant from 2014 to 2018, and oh boy, that was, I mean, if you look at some of those beads, no one had a scale of patrilocal marriage. We had to create one, and we had to find it was very, very difficult. So it took us, a full 4 years to get the data before we could crunch anything. And we looked at a variety of indicators in these 9 different clusters, right? So political stability and governance, security and conflict, including terrorism, economic performance, rentierism, health and well-being, demographic security, education, social progress, and environmental protection. So because we only had enough money to operationalize it for one time period, right, of course we had to use a cross-sectional statistical design. So I'm not going to make any sort of imputations of, strict causality or anything of the sort because, I can't based on the statistics. But we use cross-sectional multivariate regression, 7 control variables, and we chose as our standard of significance 0.001, which if you're a social scientist, is really strict. Right? We didn't want anyone coming back and saying, your level of significance was, too easy. Right? You need something more than that. We also looked at 161 outcome indicators. I don't expect you to read all of that at all. We managed to use some factor analysis and get it down to 122. But again, we did not want to be accused of cherry picking. Oh, you think women's subordination is linked to poor governance. Yeah, but you use so-and-so's indicator. If you'd used this other guy's indicator, you probably wouldn't have found that. We didn't want any of that kind of talk either, right? So we're like, let's look at as many indicators we can as a robustness check to make sure that we haven't cherry picked anything. So what did we find? Well, I knew the findings would be good, but I did not know that for some of these clusters, they would be really important. So we looked at 24 measures of political instability, freedom and autocracy, rule of law, World Bank governance indicators. We put in all the good indicators. And in 100% of the model runs, all 24 of the model runs, right? Not only was the syndrome significant at the 0.001 level, but it was either the variable with the largest effect size in the equation or the second largest effect size in the equation. All 24. For conflict and insecurity, 70% of model runs. 13 measures of political terror, 100% model runs. And this is something that's been cropping up more in the literature. So very, very strong association between the subordination of women and the rise of terror groups and terror incidents within the state. 24 measures of economic performance, 62.5% of the model runs. Rentierism, 50% of the model runs. Public health, 70.8%. Environmental preservation, an impressive 85.7%. Demographic security, how could male-female relations not be related to demographic issues? Educational attainment, 60% of model runs. Social progress, 75% of model runs. Across all 122 model runs, the syndrome was significant, and the largest or second largest effect size in 73.8% of the model runs. That's almost 3/4 of nation-state outcomes were significantly associated with whether you subordinated women or not in the way that we defined it. If you're interested in logistic regression and odds ratios, instead of me just telling you that it was significant, I can tell you that for each step worse on our scale of the subordination of women, your nation state has 1.75 times the chance of being a fragile state, 2.3 times the chance of having a government that's more autocratic, less effective, and more corrupt, 1.4 times the chance of being unstable and violent, 1.5 times the chance of experiencing terrorism, 1.25 times the chance of being poor in an economic decline, 1.4 times the chance of having a low GDP per capita, 1.3 times the chance of having low environmental quality, almost twice the chance of having a high fertility rate, 1.6 times the chance of a higher incidence of preventable deaths, 1.8 times the chance of scoring worse on the global hunger index. So these aren't little jumps. These are big jumps, right? As you curse your women, you curse your nation state, right? This is really important. Now, Rose McDermott of Brown University looked at our findings, and she had this to say. She said, the findings are clear, consistent, and statistically robust across the board. In fact, the results are the kind of thing most social scientists strive for but almost never find in the course of their careers. If these findings were about something not related to women, chances are they would be treated as revolutionary in IR theory. Indeed, the effects are much stronger than those supporting the notion of the democratic peace that has spawned an entire cottage industry of inquiry. I leave it to the reader to ponder why powerful effects regarding the treatment of women on the health and security of states do not receive such extensive attention. And in fact, one of your colleagues looked at a syllabus for international relations right here at Western Michigan University and did not find mention of these findings, all right, which is interesting. These are really revolutionary findings, right? But they're not being taken up because I suspect it's about women, right? It's about women. Why do we get these results, right? If we're talking in a theoretical sense, I think there's at least 3 reasons why we get these results. All right? Boot camp. Okay? Why are researchers finding that amazing link between terrorism and the subordination of women? And I think it's this boot camp notion. There is no better training camp for political violence and instability than lived domestic terror perpetration, right? Think about it. Studies have been done on the mass killers and terrorists here in the United States and America. Do you know what unites the 96% of them that were men? They were either arrested for or convicted of assault against a wife, an ex-wife, a girlfriend, an ex-girlfriend, a sister, or a mother. That's what unites them besides their male sex. So if you're willing to bash your wife, are you willing to shoot people inside a concert hall? All right, there's a boot camp effect here, isn't there? Okay. Second, this syndrome also creates chronic structural goads, right? If we considered your society a 3-legged stool, then if you had bride price or prevalent polygyny or sex ratio alteration, that is exactly as if you had sawed off one of the legs of the stool. Your society will never be stable. Your society will never be peaceful. Okay? You have introduced into your society a practice that has 100% certainty of destabilizing it. Okay? And then lastly, of course, you're also disempowering women. The very people whose voices could argue for an alternative understanding of what the nation should do, or where the priorities should be, or where the resource commitments should be. So when I present this, I'm usually presenting it to DOD, right? Some portion of DOD. And this is the point where I say to my DOD audience, do you consider yourself a national security realist? And of course they all say yes, because what are they going to say? No, I'm a national security idealist. No, they're not going to say that. And I say, well, I've just given you a whole interesting set of findings, right? So in light of these findings, are you a realist if you believe that what's going on with women does affect national security? Are you a realist if you believe that attempts to integrate not just the perspective of men, but the perspective of women in national security is important? But most importantly, can you call yourself a realist if you don't? Or if you won't, right? That's the key question, is how much realism can your realism stand? So at this point, there's always some bright person in the audience who says, okay, all right, you've convinced me. But it wouldn't really change anything we did, would it? And no, it actually would change quite a number of things that you do. And a fuller list can be found in our book, but here's just a few for your consideration. So if you're not tracking what's going on with women, how can you have an effective foreign policy, right? What about your situational awareness, which is a big buzzword, right, in the military? Can you anticipate instability in other countries if you're unaware of things such as the linkage to bride price or sex ratio alteration or things of this nature? You can't. Maybe you ought to be tracking those things. Right? How will the U.S. decide which subnational actors are most likely to bring stability in the long term if you don't examine how these groups are treating women and how they say they're going to treat women when they get into power? course, the archetypal example here is the Mujahideen, which we elected to support over the Soviets, right, in 1979 in Afghanistan. Do you know what the Mujahideen objected to the most, besides the fact that the Soviets were completely alien to their society? But what they really, really hated about the Soviets is that they forced their girls to go to school, and they gave their girls a vote, right? And so they were very, very open that if they got into power, they would take those things away. And we supported them anyway. And then they took them away, right? And did we really think the Taliban, who were the successors of the Mujahideen for the most part, were going to make Afghanistan into a stable society? The thought makes reason stare. How will the U.S. avoid the trap of peace negotiations where the rights of women are bargained away to make peace between warlords if it doesn't understand the linkage between peace and the empowerment of women? And of course, that's exactly what we did. That's what Donald Trump agreed to, and that's what Joe Biden executed in Afghanistan in August 2021. Is Afghanistan a stable place? Well, no, absolutely not. How would the U.S. track which of its own citizens are the greatest internal threat if domestic violence is not looked at as what it really is, domestic terror perpetration, right? You're going to be able to identify who are your most likely terrorists if you're tracking who's committing domestic terror. But we don't call it that. We call it domestic violence, and we consider it as unremarkable and as unrelated to shooting a bunch of people. But it's not. It's integrally related to shooting a bunch of people. This is something that, this linkage. And I think, a couple of years ago, actually the Secret Service wrote up a report saying exactly that, which is, the people most likely to commit terror are people who have already been arrested or convicted for domestic violence. So we need to be tracking that. Did it happen? No, but they had a report. How will you rationally approach immigration if you don't comprehend that the true clash of civilizations is not about what your religion is or what your ethnicity is, but it's about the subordination of women, right? If you're bringing practices into the country that are going to re-subordinate women, that should be an issue, right? That's got to be an issue. Australia takes this seriously. If you take the citizenship test for Australia, there's going to be questions on the test that say, is it legal in Australia to beat your wife? Is it legal in Australia to arrange a marriage for your daughter or your son? Is it legal in Australia to have your daughter's genitals cut? And of course, the skeptics go, oh, they know what the answer should be. Of course, they're going to, yeah, of course. But everyone knows what the law is, not just the men, but the women who wish to become citizens of Australia. All right? It matters that the nation of Australia tells people who wish to become its citizens that these types of practices are not welcome. Right? Important stuff. How will the U.S. know that ending child marriage worldwide would do more for world peace than almost any other intervention? You want greater world peace? Don't introduce the ballot. Introduce a ban on child marriage, right? Work for a ban on child marriage, which is a hub issue that affects health, wealth, stability, demographics, you name it. Every country that practices child marriage is mired in poverty and violence. If you don't believe it, check it, and you will find that that is so. But this is not our top priority. Right? How will the U.S. know when exporting democracy makes sense and what it doesn't? If your first political order is highly subordinative, what will introducing democratic elections do for that society? Not much, right? You cannot veneer democracy over a substrate of severe subordination of women and expect that you're going to get a liberal democracy. It just isn't going to happen, right? Maybe start with banning child marriage first and see where it goes from there. So I firmly believe that one day the idea that foreign policy or national security policy could ignore the situation of women will be seen as laughably naive. Now I'm reaching the end of my life. I don't know how many more years I have left in me, but I still hope beyond hope, all right, that this day will come. When I look at the syllabi of my colleagues in the Bush schools, sometimes I'm not so sure, and then I get depressed. But I really do think that the research is so large and so important and so significant that you'd have to be purposefully blinding your eyes not to see the linkages that we've seen here today. So given the many outcome dimensions we've looked at, I think that this quote from Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State really sums it up. The subjugation of women is a threat to the common security of our world and the national security of our country. And to that I say amen. And I think the empirics bears her out very strongly. And I think disrupting the weak points of the syndrome may be foundational to undercutting the roots of instability, conflict, and ineffective governance. And remember, what you do to your women, you do to your nation state. That's it. Thank you very much.
So we have time for a couple of questions. Anybody? Go ahead, Ashley.
I guess I want to present something of a challenge. I'm also curious about the other things that were significantly correlated with instability, if you want to speak to that. But the challenge that I want to raise was like this. Could there be a realist, maybe in some other part of the world, who watches this presentation and thinks, oh, I know what a good solution to this problem is, an enlightened form of sexism, a more sustainable form of sexism, where we control the marketplace, the sort of bridal marketplace, and we ensure that there's more access to women, and we sort of crack down on the boot camp training and terrorism and in the home, et cetera, you understand the point.
Yeah.
And so how would you respond to something like that? Your results being used essentially in a kind of perverse way.
Well, I suppose I'd be happy if my results were used at all by anybody. But, you know, I think that's a very good question. Certainly with bride price, we've seen that. Saudi Arabia caps bride prices. The Taliban caps bride prices because they know just how much instability. In fact, if you want to join the Saudi military, right, if you're a man and you sign up to join the Saudi military, they will pay your bride price because they don't want you looking for it with a side hustle using those arms they just trained you to use, right? So it's very interesting to see how some of the most autocratic societies do see the link, do cap the bride prices. Now, they're not doing it for the sake of women, okay? And I don't know if capping bride prices versus eliminating bride prices is going to make a heck of a lot of difference, to be perfectly honest with you. It's very hard to enforce these things. But let me give you an example, a really great example that's in part 3 of our book, which is on the dynamics of change. I want to talk to you about the Catholic Church in Europe. The Catholic Church in Europe, was not a feminist organization, all right? And, I think there was a couple of centuries in which they debated over whether women actually had souls or not, So this is not a feminist organization by any means. For their own self-interest, because they wanted property and riches, right? They did some interesting things, right? They outlawed cousin marriage to weaken the families, okay? Called it incest, right? 7 degrees of separation. They enforced the inheritance rights of widows because widows, rich widows, would immediately run to the church for sanctuary in a convent, because if they didn't run to the church for sanctuary, they would be immediately and forcibly married off to some other man in the family, right, to keep the inheritance. So they enforced the inheritance of widows and then created safe zones for these widows. on the condition that the widows gave them the money, right? They outlawed infanticide, period, right? They did, in other words, they did a whole number of things, not because they gave a darn about women, but because their own interests were served by this. Did it lead over time to the society becoming better for women? Yeah, it did, right? In many ways that we show in that last part of the book, it chopped away at those beads, right? And eventually when enough beads were chopped away, right, you could begin to move towards, shall we say, more democratic understanding of the household, which then made democracy within the larger society something that could be countenanced. So I believe that bad actors can do things for perverse reasons and still unintentionally start a virtuous chain. Will it always work? No. I mean, just capping bride prices is not going to help women. It may help your instability if you can enforce it, but it won't help women. But if you keep doing these things, right, I think eventually it does help change the world of women.
I was just curious, I think it's interesting, your point about child marriage in particular. So I was wondering about children as another variable. So things like child labor, infanticide of both genders. Are there other variables, again, going to the family, going to the home, that might even strengthen those correlations more, do you think?
Oh, I think so. I think that's absolutely right. Although I would like to treat, say, child labor restrictions as an outcome variable, right, a dependent variable. If you treat women better, do we actually see greater investment in children too? And I bet you we do. I absolutely think we do, because if you look back to the history of our own country, if you look back to the Lucinda Stones of Kalamazoo, Michigan, right, what you get is not simply an emphasis on improving the situation of women, which they definitely had, but also improving the situation of children. That was the next thing on there. In fact, even before women got the right to vote, they actually engaged in mass action to change something they thought was abhorrent. Do you know what that was? The legal age of marriage for girls in America, which was 11 or 12, depending upon which state you were in. And so they used their influence to try to raise those, and they got them up to about 14. In fact, North Carolina had the vestiges of that. They still had allowed 14 and 15-year-olds to be married until about 3 or 4 years ago. And that was the result of women at the turn of the century agitating for an increase in the legal age of marriage across the board. Yeah, well said.
We're having this conversation in a white settler colony that stole the land of the indigenous people through a regime of terror and enslavement. So I would ask, first of all, how you define stability and terror before I ask my question.
Well, you know, I think you and I are starting from different square ones. I believe you came in sort of late to the lecture, is that right?
I came in about 10 minutes after you started.
Well, I think it was later than that. So we started off with the first political order. And I would like to suggest to you that within every society, settler, non-settler, colonial, and indigenous, the first political order is between the men and women of that society. And that's where my focus is. In fact, I would like to suggest to you that the entire idea of colonialism actually stems from the original exploitation of rents from the bodies of women in every society. So we can start there if you'd like.
Yeah, so now I'll ask my question. How does class and race relate to gender in a regime of private property and exploitation?
Well, I think that's above my pay grade. You're looking here for a large Marxist analysis, perhaps, and I am unequipped to give it.
So, Jimmy, I'll take one last question because I need to get Valerie to another event, actually. We're running a little late.
This is a quick question.
Thank
so,
you.
It sounded like at part of the talk you were suggesting that the sort of subordination of women was kind of most in places where there's like kind of like existential threat, and the sort of male soldiers were
Yes, where they're functional, right?
So,
exactly right.
Yeah, so but isn't that already enough to explain all these sorts of negative impacts? Like if your society is, or you think your society is under existential threat, doesn't that lead to like sort of many of the like sort of discounting education and maybe like sort of.
But why would you discount it for women and not for men?
Well, but I think you're saying that there's a negative impact for everybody. I mean, the women are more subordinate in this case, but society as a whole is impacted by this.
No one has ever explained to me how an external threat necessarily leads to the subordination, first and foremost, of women. No one has ever successfully done that.
I thought that was part of your story, that it explains that
Oh, without resort to this, right? I really think that this first political order, right, explains the security provision mechanism chosen. Right? In societies where women are more equal, that may not be the security provision mechanism you would choose. Right? Think about the societies that still base their security around clans and tribes. These are the most unstable and most violent countries in the world. Right? Think about Somalia. Think about South Sudan. Think about Pakistan. So there's something deeper going on here. Right? And I think it's the subordination of women that fuels the normalization of phenomena that cause a degradation in the security of the country.
And that will have to be the last word. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you.